Hello and welcome to Understanding Emotions. My name is Sankalp. If you're new here, I am Sankalp. I recently completed my DPhil, which is Oxford's way of saying PhD, at the University of Oxford in psychology/neuroscience, where I work as a neuroscientist now. Before I begin, it's worth emphasizing that this video is separate from my work at the university. So if you're joining me live, the idea will be I'm going to record this video, which is part of a long course on memory and learning that I'm recording. So today's part will be on techniques and applications and things that you can do today to enhance your learning and performance. So I'm excited for that, but also that means if you see me like stopping and starting things in between, you know what's happening. Okay, docs. So let's go. So I'm gonna record now. Okay. So in the last few sections, we talked about the different types of memories and the one famous case of HM that really set into motion a lot of memory research that happens to date. And today what we're going to talk about in this section, what we are going to talk about is the practical to-dos, the know-hows. What do you do on a day-to-day basis if you were to enhance your memory and as a result enhance your performance and learning and whatnot? We're going to talk about all the techniques and tips and tools today. We're also going to talk about tools that you can use if you want to undo memories. So of course we can have negative memories as a result of trauma or adverse events. And sometimes we wish memories would go away, or at least the emotional charge with those events goes away. And in today's video, I'm going to talk about some recent research that we have, or well, at least research that we have, recent or not, that can help us undo some memories that perhaps we do not want to have. So this is the outline for today. What we are going to do is talk about, I hope I'm centered. So we are going to divide this section of the tools and techniques that are important for memory, improving memory and learning into 4 sections. So the first section, I'm going to talk about foods. So what are the foods that you can eat if you were to enhance your learning and memory? In the second section, I want to ensure I'm roughly halfway, we are going to talk about habits. In the third section, we are going to talk about techniques. Apologies, my arm goes underneath the microphone. Well, techniques. I promise I can spell. And in the fourth section, we are going to talk about, it's a bit of a custom section that I have created for the purpose of this video, and I call it undo, which is, all of the other sections are going to talk about how do you enhance your learning and memory. So this is going to be enhance, but this is going to be how do you forget? Like, sometimes forgetting is optimal, especially if we have adverse events, stress, trauma, conditioning, fear conditioning. And if you want to undo that, is there anything in the literature that we know of? And what are some science-based tools to undo memories? We're going to talk about that as well. Undo the emotional charge at least. So in the food category, I'm going to focus on 3 things. So of course, there are many, many foods in the market and in society. We can't possibly talk about everything. So I want to focus on few things that I think have strong evidence, or at least promising evidence, and things coupled with things that I don't think you will hear elsewhere, at least discussed in this level of evidence-based understanding. So we're going to talk about, in my opinion, what are the 3 things that you need to know. The first one would be blueberries, and actually strawberries as well, but I'm going to just mention blueberries. The second one we're going to talk about are omega-3s. And the third thing we are going to talk about is creatine. So if you've heard of creatine, you might have heard it more in a muscle building context, but actually there's some evidence to suggest that it actually enhances cognitive performance, memory, and like your brain power, so to speak. We're going to talk about all of the science in a bit, so I'm going to resist the temptation to start blurting out the science behind it. In the next section, we are going to talk about habits. So remember, we are just taking a sense of the map we are going to cover today. So in the next section, we're going to talk about habits. And Habits are more like day-to-day things, like things that I would hope you would make a part of your lifestyle. So this differs from techniques in the sense that techniques would be more like specific and you might use them strategically as and when needed, whereas habits I think are more something you would do long term and make it part of your lifestyle, so to speak. And really the two key quote unquote habits of behaviors, perhaps more appropriately put, would be strategic resting. So we all need rest and we rest, but using it strategically might enhance our learning and memory. So we're going to talk about rest essentially in habits and the critical importance of it. So I'm going to talk about wakeful rest. I'm going to talk about non-wakeful rest, which is otherwise known as sleep. Then we are going to talk about some other habits like exercise, again here pertaining more to learning and memory and that kind of thing. And then we are going to talk about meditation. So those are the 3-4 things I would cover in the habits section. Really what it is strategically using rest. Like all of these are basically versions of how do you take rest strategically. There is one more thing we could briefly talk about, which is cold exposure. So cold exposure, and that is also a kind of habit that you might or might not want to build. That is, by the way, none of this means that I actually recommend that you do everything. It just means that these are the things that I found in the science that are interesting. Pick and choose. And of course, consult your doctor, because I am not that kind of a doctor. Right. So in terms of techniques, so as I said, they differ from habits in the sense that techniques are more about things that you could strategically deploy in certain situations where you might benefit from memory enhancement. So these are not necessarily something that you do every day or even at any regular cadence, but you are like, oh, if I am faced with a memory problem, then maybe I can pick and choose with one of these techniques. So in terms of techniques, we are going to talk about here something called as memory palace. So these are techniques that memory athletes use to enhance their memory and performance and compete at the highest levels. We are going to talk about anchor systems, and I'm going to talk about what they are when we get there. We are going to talk about some evidence-based techniques like spaced repetitions. And I'm going slightly off screen, but that's all right. And we are going to talk about some other techniques like testing, also known as retrieval. And I think those will be good enough for the techniques section. Might cover one or two more if I think it's important. In fact, I'm going to just quickly have a look in just so that I don't miss anything. Yeah, I think that's it. And finally, we are going to, okay, let me actually come back. And finally, we are going to talk about how do you undo memories? How do you take these negative memories or negative associations that you might have, and how do you undo them for our well-being, for our mental health, so that things don't, for lack of a better word, trigger us as much? And how do you take negative experiences and stop being helpless around these memories? And of course, there's, depending on the severity of the conditioning, it may or may not be totally gone, but you'd be pleased to know that there are science-based techniques that are shown to reduce traumatic memories. So there are two things I'm going to talk about here. One of them is going to be this technique called EMDR, very, very evidence-based for things like PTSD. Again, resisting the urge to go into the science immediately. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the technique is not as difficult to learn. And then we are going to talk about this thing called the Pennebaker protocol. And really it's under the larger category of journaling, but since this particular type of a journaling has a lot of evidence around it, I thought I would mention it in specifics here, but really I suspect a lot of journaling techniques would also work here. I'm going to talk about some things when we get there. So again, this is the lay of the land for today. I hope you're excited to learn about the evidence, the science. So we're going to talk about 4 sections, four broader categories to enhance memory and learning. The first one would be the category of food. The second one would be the category of habits. The third one would be the category of techniques. And the fourth one would be, how do you undo memories? How do you lose things that you do not want? So now, starting with blueberries. Okay, that was section 1. Let's stop recording for a minute. Get a sip of water. Give me a second. Fantastic. Okay, just revising my own memory on these. Okay, cool. I think we are ready, so let's start. We are going to start our discussion of techniques to enhance learning and memory with the section of food. So what are the foods and supplements we can take to enhance our learning and memory? And to start with, we're going to start with blueberries. Now, blueberries are obviously a very common fruit that you can get into the supermarket in most places, in most countries. I appreciate there would be countries where this would be not possible or very expensive, but just to stick to the science for a bit, blueberries and strawberries, we know we can get quite easily, and they are garden variety fruits. And what we have found is these can significantly enhance your learning, memory, cognitive aging, decline cognitive aging, and so on. So here's the evidence around blueberries. So there's this scientist by the name of DeVore. What I try to do is try to say the name of the first author at least, because that's how science is reported, and I try to name the journal for the most part so that you are able to cross-check this if you need it, or dig deeper. So that's going to be the format. Roughly when I talk about the names, it's going to be the name of the first author, always acknowledging that there's normally a team that does the work. It's not just one person. So scientist by the name of DeVore, 2012, in the journal Annals of Neurology, they published this very interesting study where they took a group of older women, and they started working with them in the 1980s. And so what they did was, they started working in the 1980s, but beginning 1991, every 2 years, they gave these women a bunch of cognitive tests. So tests like, you give them certain things to remember, and you test them later, and so on. And so this was their measure of performance. But at the same time, these scientists were also tracking these women's lifestyle. So for example, they were monitoring what food they are eating. And what they found is one of the biggest relationships with performance and what enhanced their performance. Let me do that again. And what they found was there was a strong relationship between the memory and performance, learning performance of these women, especially in their older age, with something in their food that they were eating. And this was the strawberries and blueberries in their diet. In other words, the participants who had a lot of berries in their diet tended to be better performers in these cognitive tasks that these experimenters were making these women do. And so the hypothesis was that the anthocyanins, so these are the compounds in blueberries that give it their blue color. These anthocyanins from blueberries go to the hippocampus, which we have been talking about as a region in the brain which is critically important for learning and memory, and it tended to increase the performance in in the hippocampus, improve the function of the hippocampus. So what they found was that the anthocyanins from blueberries, which are these bright blue compounds, it entered the bloodstream, entered the brain, and it seemed to improve the function of the hippocampus, which is, again, as we've been talking about, a region that is implied in memory. So in other words, you could say that these anthocyanins, it's the hypothesis of the researchers, were preventing cognitive decline in the hippocampus. Now, you might think that, okay, this study is done in women. What about everyone else? Is this effect specific to older women? And I'm pleased to say that subsequently there have been plenty of studies, including randomized controlled trials, which are thought to be the gold standard of scientific evidence, or medical evidence at least. And they found that there are plenty of studies that show that the effect of berries seems to hold in older adults, children, younger adults as well. So there are individual studies testing these effects. And it sounds like berries overall are a winner in terms of brain performance, memory, learning, declining cognitive aging, and so on. So sounds like a good thing. Now, when we talk about berries, there's often this question of, can I supplement? Like, can I take anthocyanins in pill form? Like, I myself take a supplement which has anthocyanins in it. And is that good enough, or do we have to take berries, and what is the dosage like? So to answer the first question, I think it's fair to say generally that food is better. All of these studies are done in food, with real food, not exactly supplements. And so there is more evidence for food than there is for supplements. Now, until a few years ago, I think there was a general idea that supplements do not work at all, and it is only food that works, especially in terms of these cognitive sort of markers. And in my course of research especially in the last couple of years, there seems to be new studies coming along that suggest that supplements actually do work. Now, they may or may not work as well as the food. So at least as the time of this recording, I'm more comfortable suggesting food as the main driver of these effects, but there is evidence suggesting that supplements also do some work, perhaps incomplete, perhaps not exactly the full plethora of benefits that food might give us. But also I acknowledge that, it's not always possible to ensure everything in our diets is on point. So in that case, something like supplements might work. Now, of course, with anything I will say today, please do consult your doctor. I'm not going to repeat this warning again, but please do consult your doctor. I'm a PhD, not a medical doctor. And so individual circumstances differ. Your health history might be different. And so do consult your doctor if in doubt. All right. So now the question of dosage. Like, how many berries are these people eating to experience these cognitive benefits? Is it going to be like a truckload of berries, or is it just like one or two snack on the side might be good enough? And in case of berries specifically, the evidence is actually quite interesting. So I'm looking at this paper by Lorzadeh, and apologies for the pronunciation. This is a 2025 paper in the journal Current Nutrition Report. And what they found was duration, meaning how long you're taking these berries, might be more important than the dosage itself. So the normal recommendation I see floating around is, 1 cup of berries a day. But I think the evidence seems to be more complicated than that. And it seems to be the case that if you take berries for a longer time, that is way more important than really optimizing the dosage itself. So in the literature, the number in terms of duration seems to be 12 to 24 months to see any effect at all. Now, this is quite important because a lot of people take strawberries and take blueberries. They might even take it for a week and they think, oh, I'm not noticing any change. Is this really working? Is the science worth it? And really, for them, I would say it's important to look at the literature carefully. And it seems to me, especially when it comes to the cognitive benefits, especially when it comes to the benefits on learning and memory, that a minimum requirement for the time you need to give to see these effects are actually 12 to 24 months. And even then, it's probably not going to be like, you're going to be superhuman and you're going to memorize and learn everything. But it's probably going to be more subtler than that. measurable for sure because these studies are measuring it, but it's just to say that it's more of a slow burn than a quick snap if you are expecting any benefits to come from blueberries. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the landscape that we have for blueberries. I'm now going to move on to, so hopefully this gives you a sense of the landscape we have with blueberries. I'm now going to move on to the next one, which is omega-3s. Okay, fantastic. That was blueberries. Let's get a sip of water. Yeah, by the way, feel free to hop on and hop off. I totally understand. And in fact, I mean, it's I've had a few people come in and on. That's good. Okay, cool. Ready for omega-3s. One of my favorites, omega-3s. We're live, we're recording. Okay. So the next substance we are going to talk about is omega-3s. Now, omega-3s are substances found in fatty acids. Let's do that again. The next thing we are going to talk about is the next compound we are going to talk about is omega-3s. Most people get omega-3s. These are types of fatty acids, and most people get them through eating fish, and more specifically oily fish. So this is fishes like tuna, for example. And these oily fish contain essential fatty acids like omega-3s. There are a couple of types of omega-3s like DHA, EPA, so on. We're not going to go into the nitty-gritties for the purposes of today, but know that that distinction exists. And critically, for our discussion today, it seems like omega-3s are heavily involved in shaping brain function and preventing aging of the brain and so on. And there's some decent evidence to suggest that is the case. So let's look at some evidence that I have noted down for you. Oh, by the way, it's also important to note that fish is, while it is probably the main source of omega-3s for most people, it's not the only source. And indeed, there are more sources that do not depend on eating fish. So for example, vegetarian sources include nuts. Walnuts are a fantastic source of omega-3s. There is olive oil. Extra virgin olive oil has many benefits, including containing omega-3s, which might be good for cognitive aging or slowing down cognitive aging and so on. So there's this paper by this chap called Shahinfar 2025 in this journal called Scientific Reports. And what they did, the reason why I chose this study to talk about omega-3s is because this study looked at 58 studies. So it's what's called a meta-analysis. Now, when scientists use that word called meta-analysis, what they're doing is taking a bunch of studies from different people and different laboratories and different countries, and they're trying to analyze them into one study to see if we can draw some conclusions based on these different studies. So this particular paper looked at 58 studies, and they found that there is a strong effect of omega-3 with cognitive performance, including learning and memory. And what they found was that it was actually not just simple as, all omega-3 is good, period, we proved something. But there was actually a more subtle relationship with the dosage people are taking. So first of all, it seems to matter that the effects of omega-3 come after, roughly speaking, 2000 milligrams per day. Now that is a fair amount, and it's not unlikely that you might not be meeting that requirement, even if you're taking eating oily fish quite often. So it's possible. It might be worth checking, but it's in this study they found the effects above 2000 milligrams a day, and the effects are the following. So what they found significantly was improved was things like attention, perceptual speed, language, memory, visuospatial function, and what they call global cognitive abilities, which I'm guessing just like a catch-all phrase for many things that we might call cognitive ability. And interestingly, they also found that there was a dose response pattern, meaning how much you take it affects some of the following that I'm going to just say now. So episodic memory tends to have this U-shaped curve, meaning in the beginning, the effect on memory, episodic memory in particular, which if you remember from the first section, is this idea of how well do I remember episodes from my life. That tends to go down actually the moment you start taking omega-3s. And I think the trough, the bottom of that U-shaped curve is around 1000 milligrams. And by the time you're back to 2000, it starts increasing and you're actually in the strongly increasing part of the arm already. So again, there's this interesting relationship between omega-3s that taking a little bit of them seems to actually have a bit of a negative effect when it comes to learning and memory. But once you cross that threshold of 2000, then it seems to be quite beneficial. So again, an interesting nuance there to consider. At this point, I should also mention that the FDA in the USA, which is responsible for Food and Drug Administration, by the way, which is responsible for setting safety limits for foods and whatnot, they do set an upper cutoff of 3000 milligrams per day, of which 2000 is the max that could come from supplements. So if you are considering supplements, again, consult your doctor. Then the limit set on supplements seems to be 2000 milligrams a day. Now that's good because in terms of studies, that seems to align well with what we think works best in terms of cognitive aging and learning and performance. So that's what I take myself for what it's worth. And if you do consider it, it's a number to look at, which is 2000 milligrams a day. And so hopefully this gives you a sense that omega-3s might be critical for improving our learning and performance. Just to come back to the lay of the land, to the map that we are covering today, we have talked about blueberries, we've talked about omega-3s, and now we're going to talk about creatine. Cool. Excellent. Well done. Cool. Creatine, sip of water. Okay. Okay. Creatine. So we're now going to talk about creatine. So creatine is a substance that we can ingest. It's a supplement that we can take. Monohydrate creatine seems to be the one that has the maximum evidence. So that's what I would recommend. And creatine is well known in the fitness / the bodybuilding community as some drug that really enhance your muscle performance, your performance in the gym. But recently what we have been finding, actually did not press record, so we're gonna redo that. Okay. Creatine is a substance that we can ingest that is quite often associated with performance in the gym. So if you're a gym bro or gal and likes to work out, chances are that you've heard of creatine. And what it does is it enhances your performance in the gym by, giving you that little bit of extra energy every time you're there. And the effects of creatine on muscle hypertrophy and performance in the gym is quite well known. And by the way, it doesn't have to be gym. It could just generally athletic and sport performance. But recently what we're beginning to find is quite fascinating, which is creatine is not only important for physical performance, but it also seems to be important for cognitive performance. And this actually makes sense because in your brain, well, first of all, you might know that your body and your brain uses ATP to generate energy, and the P in the ATP stands for phosphate. And that phosphate actually comes from creatine. It's not that creatine in itself has phosphate when you ingest it, but in the body, a phosphate groups get attached to this creatine, creating what's called phosphocreatine. And this phosphocreatine actually donates phosphate to ADP, adenosine diphosphate, in your brain to make it ATP, adenosine triphosphate, which is obviously the energy building blocks of your brain. So creatine is quite important, and indeed of your body. So creatine is quite important, and it turns out there's a limited stock of creatine in your brain. So what happens is when you supplement, you're just increasing that stock, which logically suggests that there's just more available, so that if you're doing something intense which needs that extra brain power, then possibly creatine might be involved. So now that's the theory. Now, of course, that doesn't mean many things can happen in between and it might not work. So is there evidence to suggest that creatine does improve performance? And I'm pleased to say that the evidence says and suggests a yes, although I would caveat it by saying this is fairly a moving target right now. And while there's promising early evidence, we need to still look out for what's happening, and I'm excited to see where this field goes. But just to point out what we have so far and some studies I did note down. So it seems like the cognitive and memory related effects of creatine starts at a dose of 3 grams a day. So that's what the literature is investigating, and it goes all the way up to 20 grams a day. So there's this fantastic study by this author called Prokopides, Greek perhaps, in 2022 in the journal Nutrition Reviews. And what they did is they examined 10 different randomized controlled trials. So whenever I see a study that looks at many studies, to me that's a stronger evidence base, and it's a study that I'm likely to trust more. So 10 different randomized controlled trials, which in themselves are quite a powerful design. And what they found was creatine supplementation, so supplementing with creatine, improved measures of memory specifically. And the dosage there in these studies, as I said earlier, ranged from 3 grams all the way up to 20 grams a day. Now, a good thing about creatine is because it's been investigated and tested in the sport literature quite often, we do know that it has a very good safety profile. So in the hypertrophy sport literature, like seriously high dosages have been tested. Like we just talked about the randomized control trials going all the way up to 20 grams. So I suspect 3-5 grams, which is what most people will take, should be pretty safe. But there are a few things to note about creatine. The safety itself seems to be pretty okay, but not everyone is a responder. Meaning you might be the kind who takes creatine but does not see any effects. Now, again, a response in this context is normally measured in terms of sport performance. I don't think we have as much evidence to suggest what it might mean for cognitive performance. Personally, I do find that whenever I'm ingesting creatine, I do perform better in the gym and I'm a bit more sharper. And sometimes I also take it as a little bit of a mitigation for sleep deprivation. Like if I've did not manage to sleep very well, which is increasingly rare, but when that happens, I do find creatine helps my brain function a little bit better. Although I'm not particularly aware of the evidence there. I've heard of it, but I've not read it myself. And there are some side effects of creatine that one might expect. So a lot of people do experience gastrointestinal distress, meaning an upset stomach, when they ingest creatine. So watch out for that. And again, consult your doctor. Maybe a dose needs to be adjusted or whatnot. And indeed, some people will experience weight gain as a result of creatine. And in fact, I would say that most people would experience weight gain as a result of ingesting creatine. And the reason for that is actually not something that's going wrong, but something that's going right. So what happens again in terms of creatine's function in your muscles is that there's actually just more creatine getting stored in your muscles, and it does tend to increase water retention in the muscle. As a result, you will gain weight. It shouldn't be like an infinite weight gain. It should plateau at some point. But most people who would start taking creatine would expect some getting some points on the scale. But it's not necessarily a bug. It's a feature. And if you know what to look out for, then perhaps that will not distress you as much. So now I'm while there is some mounting evidence for creatine clearly in terms of cognitive benefits, I must mention that it still does not qualify for a regulatory health claim. So if some company goes onto the market and says this improves your memory and makes a health claim around it, that does not qualify because the many food safety organizations do not think the evidence is there yet. And I thought that is important to mention as well. So it's more in the science experimental stage, promising effects, but not to the extent that we can make health claims about it. So that was creatine. Hopefully you found that interesting. So just to give you a lay of the land, we've talked about now all the foods that we're going to cover today, and don't worry, there's bonus if you want more. We're going to talk about, we've talked about already blueberries, omega-3s and creatine. And before I wrap this section on food, I want to talk about some bonus food items that did not make it to this detailed cut, but I think still are quite important. So the first bonus food I want to talk about is coca, meaning chocolate. Now, to be clear, this is not the chocolate that you get in the supermarket because a lot of it is very little coca and a lot of it is sugar and milk and things that may not be ideal, and at least not for memory and learning and that kind of thing. But there seems to be a strong relationship between coca, which is chocolate, and a person's cognitive memory, cognitive processing, and that kind of thing. So there is a paper in 2014 in the journal Nature Neuroscience. Nature Neuroscience, probably widely considered the top neuroscience journal in the world. Probably a close second would be Neuron, or equivalent would be Neuron. But just to say, this is not a easy journal to get your study in. And they had this interesting design where they had a high coca group which took 900 milligrams of coca a day. That's a lot of chocolate, and it's most chocolates would have like 15, 20, 30 milligrams of coca, so a lot of chocolates. And then they had a low coca group which took 45 milligrams, and this was part of their diet for 3 months. These subjects were 50 to 69-year-olds, so slightly on the middle age, older side. And what they found was a high coca intervention. So the people who were in the high coca group the people in the high coca group had enhanced function in this part of the brain called the dentate gyrus, which is part of the hippocampus, by the way. And this is a part of the brain often associated with memory-related decline, so cognitive aging. And so they found that coca did seem to, slow down your brain aging process, essentially. And the way they looked at it was they found like increased blood volume in the hippocampus. So again, this is not just, you give a dietary intervention and you measure it in terms of testing, like behavioral tests, but these people actually looked through an MRI in the brain itself. And they found that increased blood volume, part of the hippocampus that is associated with memory and cognitive decline. Now, the reason why I put it in the bonus section, and I did not make it the highlight of today's food section, is because there was actually a failed replication of this at a slightly lower dosage of coca. So if you reduce the dosage at like 400, 500 milligrams, then it seems like the cognitive effects do not happen. Now, this is unfortunate, but nature has no obligation to fit into neat binaries. So replication was not observed at a lower dose, but other benefits like cardiovascular health improvements were still observed. So in this study, they found that it's, by the way, the same replication study that did not work for cognitive stuff. They still found that a 27% reduction in their cardiovascular mortality risk. So that's still quite significant. So I personally do take some serving of chocolate every day. It's included in the protein powder I take every morning. So sort of it's easy to take, tastes kind of good. I mean, it's not the sweet kind of chocolate in the supermarket, so it's bitter and that kind of thing. But it still tastes nice. I think I've at least grown used to the taste, and I do feel energized. And in a separate context, I'm aware that coca is also used as an intervention for chronic fatigue syndrome. So it will give you a level of energy for reasons we'll not go into in this video, but there are cardiovascular benefits, there's energy related benefits, there's possibly cognitive benefits. So I think coca is a star, but if you talk about memory specifically, the story is a little bit more complicated. Okay, so that was the bonus on coca. There are some other things that, again, I'm going to just talk about in one sentence, but there are things like leafy greens, so eat your vegetables. That has a strong effect on memory, and no one is going to criticize me for saying eat your vegetables, so I'm happy to say that. There is green tea and L-theanine more specifically, which is part of green tea, that can have cognitive benefits. Again, the evidence is there and growing, and so something to look at as well. And then there is magnesium threonate, and while a lot has been spoken about magnesium and its cognitive benefits, in my mind, reading the literature, this seemed to have the weakest evidence, at least pertaining to performance and memory. Now, it might have other benefits like recovery and muscle relaxation and so on, but in terms of brain performance, I've personally found the benefits to be not very convincing. I might change my mind with this, but the evidence seems to be quite weak. And this holds for all types of magnesium. So threonate is the one that's discussed, that crosses the blood-brain barrier and so on, but there's not really been human studies that have shown any meaningful effects. So I'm personally not super convinced, but might change my mind. Okay, cool. Right, so now we are ready to talk about the habits section. Oh boy, time flies so slow when you're recording. How long have I been going on for? Has it been half an hour? Probably more than half an hour. Wow, 50 minutes. Not even on section 2. Let's go. Let's speed up. Okay, now having covered the food section, we now move our attention to the next section, which is habits. And so this section is really a story of rest, apart from cold exposure, which is anything but rest. But this section is really a story of rest. Now, recall in the neuroscience bits, in the neuroscience section, we talk about how resting in animals and mice tend to improve their learning and memory. And this was, because there's like hippocampal replay. So your hippocampus replays the sequence of things that got you benefits and rewards and successes. And there's a very elegant and interesting neuroscience behind it, which I hope you have watched. And if not, I recommend it. But really what it teaches us that we potentially could use rest and strategic rest to improve our learning and memory. And indeed, that seems to be the case when you test it directly. So in this section, we're going to talk about wakeful rest. We're going to talk about not wakeful rest, otherwise known as sleep, exercise, meditation, cold exposure. Let's start with wakeful rest. So to really explain this idea, I would like you to really explain this idea of, let me come here. To explain this idea of wakeful rest and how it can improve our learning and performance, we need to look at this elegant study done by Devar in 2012. This study is published in this journal called Psychological Science. And what they found is pretty simple. They gave people a cognitive task. Their memory was tested, except in some people, they asked them to rest for 10 minutes. And this was while they were awake, no sleep involved, just rest. And what they found is that in people who took that wakeful rest, memory was enhanced. Their performance was enhanced. And so this gives us a very direct evidence that, look, learning and memory is enhanced when you strategically take rest after you have learned something. So if you're, for example, thinking of learning for an exam, or if you have a presentation to give which needs you to memorize some things, then strategic resting after you have done the memorization bit might improve your learning and performance. In fact, I'm pretty sure it will improve your learning and performance. So just so that you know, it's not just a matter of one study. Ever since, there have been many studies that have shown a very similar effect, and the rest timing critically did not matter too much. So in the beginning, the thought was, oh, looks like 10 minutes is important. Like, you know, that there was like a rigidity around that. But reading the literature, it seems like the timing itself does not matter too much. And there have been studies that have looked at as low as 5 minutes, and there have been studies that have looked at longer rest periods, and they all seem to have benefits in improving performance. Now, the lower limit that I have found in studies seems to be 5 minutes, but really that does not necessarily mean that fewer minutes may not work. And so this is something you might want to experiment with in your own life to see what might be the optimal time for you. Personally, I've found that even brief moments of resting attention, and you know, you could have these moments of meditation where you're just focusing on the breath. That's it. I found that even that just improves my concentration a little bit. Now, of course, I've not done any proper test to say if it improves the learning and memory, perhaps not that much, but it is promising for me to see that the rest is important, and there is a variation in how much rest you take, and it could be as low as 5 minutes, at least from the literature itself. Now, there's a super interesting study published in 2025. The name of the author is Putter, Putter, in the journal Scientific Reports. And what they found is that, sure, rest does improve learning and memory, but so does usage of social media. Now, this can be like weird, and look, by no means am I suggesting that you should be checking social media while you're learning things. But it seems like rest can be quite loosely defined. It's not just that rest in terms of, oh, you close your eyes, you meditate, you focus on your breath. They may not need that uptight, formal structure, but just taking some sort of a break, including what seems like a distraction like social media, also enhanced these participants' learning, memory, performance. So there might be reasons to not use social media for other reasons, including mental health. It seems like just the basic feature of it, which is that it momentarily gives you rest from your core activity, is good enough to improve performance. And personally, I like to just take a little bit of a walk, visit the restroom, maybe even listen to something in the middle, a little bit of a podcast. And that does seem to give me the adequate break needed. And it does seem to anecdotally just improve my performance. So wakeful rest seems to have a nice effect on improving learning and memory. And it's beautiful when you can predict such a effect just by knowing the mechanism itself. And this is when in the neuroscience bit, we talked about how the rest in mice improved their performance. Right. So now the big daddy, having covered wakeful rest, we are now going to go to the big daddy of rest, which is sleep. And look, much has been said about sleep, and I plan to do a full video series on it, just like I've done on memory. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about what sleep is and the architectures of sleep and whatnot. But suffice it to say that sleep is perhaps one of the most important things you could do to improve your memory, especially what's called memory consolidation, meaning the storage of short-term memory into long-term memory. So think of something that you have learned today. If you want that to become relatively permanent or relatively long-lasting, then sleep is one of the most important things you could do. Now, there is a fantastic, let me come up here. Now, there is a fantastic review by the author's name is Lutz in 2026. This is in a journal called Physiological Reviews, where they did a very nice overview of what sleep does. And I really liked what they talked about the role of NREM and REM sleep. So non-REM and REM sleep. REM stands for rapid eye movement. This is part of the stage of different stages of sleep. So these are two different stages of sleep. And what they found was the non-REM sleep tends to be important for, setting the canvas. So this is the part of your brain that, it's if you think about it as a painting, the non-REM sleep is more like setting a canvas. getting the paint ready, getting the setup ready, and REM sleep seems to be doing the actual painting, or especially the emotional contents of the memory. If you think of it as a painting, that's where apparently the brain is encoding these emotionally laden things in your long-term memory. So there seems to be a role and a nice distinction between the REM and non-REM phases of your sleep. Now, I understand I've totally glossed over it, and that's only because sleep is a topic that deserves a lot of attention in a separate video. But hopefully this is enough for you to just know that sleep is super important. It's super critical for memory retention, especially long-term consolidation of memory. Okay. Having talked about wakeful rest and having talked about sleep, the next thing we're going to talk about is exercise. Now, recall in our previous video on the mechanism, I talked about how when mice and even humans, when they are in a little bit of stress after learning things, then that stress seems to be doing a good job of solidifying that memory, increasing that short-term performance measured immediately after, and so on. And so there seems to be, if adrenaline is pumping in your system after learning, to some extent, not a lot so that you're just basically traumatized, but to some extent, that seems to be beneficial for improving your learning and memory performance. And exercise tends to be a very neat way for strategically increasing your adrenaline, for strategically stressing your body out a little bit. And so exercise has a nice effect on improving learning and memory and performance. And the mechanism is possibly the fact that it does give your body a little bit of a stressor. So acute exercise is known to raise dopamine. We talked about it in the dopamine video, but also noradrenaline, which is this molecule in the brain, which gives us a little bit of a stress signal, and alertness perhaps is a better way to say it. And it's therefore found to enhance hippocampal consolidation. Hippocampus, again, being the part of the brain responsible for memory. Long-term exercise has been shown to promote hippocampal neurogenesis. That's just fancy words for saying that the cells of the hippocampus seems to grow better and faster and more, or at least it promotes that. Exercise seems to promote the increase and the growth of the cells in the hippocampus. And there is a very nice, neat study that came out pretty recently from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where they showed that exercise can even improve therapeutic outcomes. Now, in this case, the study, the exercise happened before therapy. And what they found is that if you go into therapy and you have exercised a bit, it seems to be beneficial for your healing process. So overall, the effects of exercise on the brain pretty solid. And even in terms of memory, the specific one unidimensional benefit of learning and performance, exercise seems to have a very critical role. Now, of course, the role of exercise for human health is not limited to memory. So this is one of those things that just seems to raise the tide of human health. And I highly recommend that you have some sort of an exercise routine in your day-to-day lives. Personally, I work out 3 times a week at the bare minimum, and then I try to do one day a week also of stretching. So that's my personal routine. Of course, there's many ways to thread this needle, and by no means is this the gold standard. And so do whatever you think is right for you, consulting people, watching videos and whatnot. And I might personally do a video on exercise at some point as well. All right. So we have covered wakeful rest, we have covered sleep, we have covered exercise. Now it is time to talk about meditation. Now again, meditation falls in this category of rest. So it's not clear to me that, a specific kind or meditation in itself is needed for improving performance. Perhaps most of the effects are just simply explained by just closing your eyes. We don't know that. I think there's not enough for me to be confident one way or the other. But the reason why I do include meditation as a separate bit is because of the evidence that when you look at the brain of people who have taken a short-term meditation course, it tends to increase the volume in the hippocampus. So we know that it increases behavioral performance. We know that it increases volume in the hippocampus. So perhaps there's a there in terms of increasing memory. Weaker effects, not as strong as something like blueberries, but still there, and I think it's worth mentioning. So Hosel in 2011 in the journal Psychiatry Research Neuroimaging, they found that meditation increased gray matter volume. It's basically the volume of the neurons, part of the neurons in the brain, to put it simply, in the hippocampus. So meditation increased gray matter volume in the hippocampus. Brown in 2016 in the journal PLOS One reported that direct effect of meditation on memory performance. So just so that we know, it's not just this brain artifact, there's actually a behavioral effect on memory performance, which is what we ultimately want. So decent evidence, I would say, and definitely worth considering as part of your habits. And finally, we're going to talk about cold exposure. And now this again works with this mechanism of, stress after learning bout. So again, when I talk about cold exposure, and it happened in the dopamine video, people think that I'm trying to say that you should do all of these, but that's not really the intention. The intention is to, survey the literature to see what's working. And, some things may or may not work for you for many different reasons. And with cold exposure, people often point out that the original study that showed that it increased dopamine in the brain was only done on men. And that's actually true. That's completely true. Having said that, in terms of increasing memory and performance, again, we know that cold exposure would create a bit of an adrenaline spike, hopefully a controlled one, not something that's extreme. And Cahill in 2003 found that learning and memory was enhanced, especially memory consolidation, with post-learning stress, especially the stress invoked by cold exposure. So basically what they are finding is if you have some cold exposure, then it improves post-learning performance. Now, this sample did include women. So I'm hesitant to say that, cold exposure simply does not work for women, or that it's highly recommended for women either. I'm not personally convinced on either side. So I think the diplomatic answer in this situation would be, listen to your body yourself, and listen to your doctor and consult your doctor, perhaps is a better way of saying it. But purely in terms of the science, purely in terms of the research, which tends to be my area of expertise, there is evidence that learning and memory might be enhanced in men and women both. And the mechanism tends to be this post-learning stress. So putting your body in some stress after learning does increase learning and performance. Okie doke. So that was the habits section. Fantastic. Maybe just let's, okay, I'll do an overview in a bit. Okay, super. Good. Lots of viewers, lots of people coming in and going out. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. I need to pee. So whether I like it or not, I need to take a little bit of a minute or two, not too much. We'll be back. We're going to talk about techniques. We're going to talk about all of these lovely techniques to improve memory and performance. Then we're going to talk about how do you undo things. See you in a minute or so. All right, I'm back. Quick bathroom break there. Okay, good. Good to see all of you. Okay, let's record the techniques bit. All right, so again, to place ourselves on the map is we have talked about food, we have talked about the effects of blueberries, omega-3s, creatine, we talked about habits like rest, sleep, exercise, meditation, cold exposure. And now we're going to talk about specific techniques. The way I think about it, the way techniques differ from habits is habits are what they sound like. It sounds like they are repetitive, they are sort of part of your lifestyle. It almost defines sometimes who you are. So, when I tell people that, I end my showers with a minute of cold exposure, it tends to create a bit of a personality. It creates a bit of an image in people's minds of who you are. Techniques, in my view, are something that you use, something that you might strategically deploy at certain situations. So an example of that would be, when I go to work, I have to take with me my ID card, otherwise the doors to the office would not work. The same ID also works at my gym. It's a university facility. Then there is my keys, because otherwise I would not be able to cycle. Like my keys open the doors to my house when I return. And then there is the mobile, of course, who can't live with their mobile phone. Then there are headphones and earphones and things like that. There are gloves, because it often gets cold in Oxford. Then I would like to put on some sunscreen and that kind of thing. So you can see that the list piles on. And it's not very nice when I've started cycling halfway through and I realize that, look, I've forgotten my ID card or I've forgotten my keys. Well, I can't forget my keys because otherwise the cycle would not unlock. But even when I've gone down and I realize, hey, just the keys are just not in my pocket. So how do you, like in a situation like that, can I deploy a technique that will ensure that guarantee is a strong word, but quite likely that I will not forget any of these. Now, interestingly, while these things are important for day-to-day lives, there is such a thing as memory competition, and memory is often treated as a sport by many people. And what these memory athletes do is they have to figure out ways to remember things. And thanks to them, we know a lot of techniques and systems that tend to work if we want to memorize really, really long lists, not just, 7 or 10 item things. And look, before I talk about the techniques to enhance your memory, there is something to be said about simply writing things down and putting a checklist on the back of your door, something like that, where you can just read through it, and then probably that's the easiest way of doing it. Perhaps an even easier way is to just remember and make it a habit to put things back in your pocket, so that next time, if it's like a coat or a jacket that you wear quite often, like a winter jacket, then most of the things are already there. And there are times when you switch everything together. So while we will talk about how do you enhance memory, something is to be said about just using external techniques. So just like offloading the stress from your brain to something else, and that will probably solve problems better than techniques themselves. But quite often we are not able to do that, and quite often things change and are dynamic. And so what are some techniques that we can deploy to enhance our memory, perhaps for a test that you're working on, or perhaps for a presentation? Like I myself try to memorize a lot of things that I'm talking about, so that I minimize the time that I'm reading and I maximize the time I'm speaking to you. And that tends to generally create a better experience, I feel. So to talk about techniques, the first technique we are going to cover is what's called the memory palace. Now, this is a technique that memory athletes use quite often. Like this probably might even be their main technique. And so it's quite interesting and cool to remember it. And perhaps even more interesting is this idea that the memory palace is coming from a mechanism that we already know. So in the neuroscience section, we talked about how the brain encodes physical space. So relationship between, if I want to go to the supermarket, the brain is probably creating a map And there are place cells and grid cells that support the creation of that map. And then we discovered that abstract spaces, so things like the hierarchy of birds or the hierarchy in your office, may utilize the same infrastructure in the brain. And I think at this point, there's very, very strong evidence to suggest that is the case. Now the question is, can we flip it on its head? So if I have to remember something, can I utilize a map of the world that I already have in the brain and then just put the things that I want to memorize at memorable locations in that map? So let me give you an example. When I was doing my PhD a few years ago, I lived in a very fancy Oxford college. So there were like very lovely landmarks inside and outside the college, which I could think of. So for example, I could think of this fancy-ish room that I had. It actually had a fireplace inside it, which was quite, memory evoking. And then, when I went out, I stepped into a very fancy building. It's called the Sheldonian Theatre, by the way. You could look it up. That's where I graduated. And then if I walked a little bit further, there was a very nice library called the Western Library and Blackwell's Bookshop, one of the oldest bookshops in Oxford and indeed the world, perhaps. I guess that's what I'm told. That's the myth, at least. True or not, I have not verified. And then if I just walked a little bit further, there was a college called Balliol College, and then further was a supermarket. So these were like memorable landmarks for me. And what I had done is essentially tried to place different things at those landmarks. So for example, if I'm thinking about the items I need to carry with me for the work, the PhD at that time, then I would place my keys near the fireplace. So mentally, I would build this image that near the fireplace are this big set of keys. And it helps to make things a bit absurd so that it strikes out to you and you remember a bit better. So like you can imagine like the fireplace has fire in it and there's like keys that are melting in it. Perhaps that gives you a little bit of a Lord of the Rings type feeling. So that's near the fireplace, my keys. Then I can imagine the place where I graduated, the Sheldonian, and I can perhaps imagine a graduation hat. At that time I hadn't graduated, I had some different sort of heuristics in mind. But regardless, I could imagine perhaps thinking of my ID card. So I could think of like the dome. So the Sheldonian has a little bit of a dome-like structure. And I could imagine like an ID card, the lanyard of my ID card just hanging by it. Perhaps like waving like a flag. Your imagination is the limit. And I suppose you get this idea. And because I had taken that route so many times in my life, now what's happening is I'm anchoring that solid map that I have in my mind to specific things that I want to remember. So again, the ring, the lanyard, the let's say there is something like, what else do I need? Perhaps the gloves is near the supermarket, and then I can imagine me buying gloves in the supermarket. So let's keep it to the list of 3. And then when I want to recall these things, so when time comes to go to the shop go to the work and I need these things, and let's say the 3-item thing was actually a 10-item thing, then I could just walk my way through this map. So start from the fireplace, go to the Sheldonian, the theater where I graduated, then go to the supermarket, and then just collect the items in my mental map as I go. And in the beginning, this might sound like, oh, this is such a tedious process to remember your keys. And it is. As I said, there are easier ways to do it. But it does get quite fast pretty soon. And you might be able to traverse that distance like in a matter of seconds, if not even faster, like 1 or 2 seconds even sometimes. And so it does get better with practice. So if there's something that you really need to remember and your life depends on it, then this is one of the most important things you could ever do. And it's one of the most important techniques you could utilize. The list can get really long, by the way. So when I was doing my master's at University College London, I participated in this experiment, this memory experiment, where I had to remember, I don't know, but 20, 25 item lists. And I had to like recall them, not just the items in a list, but I had to know which one is where and which one follows which one, and the relationship between these things. And in the beginning, it took me like 10, 15 minutes of practice to memorize. And then by the end, when I was in the brain scanner doing this, I was just like rapidly, within a matter of seconds, telling the researcher what's where. So very, very powerful technique, especially useful when the workload is worth it. So if you have an important keynote presentation, which particularly involves a lot of information and perhaps getting a job or something like that, depends on it, absolutely use this technique. So that was the memory palace technique. I hope you get a good idea of what this is. Then I'm going to talk about anchor systems in general. So memory palace could be thought of as a subset of a larger set of techniques called the anchor systems. And what this is essentially saying is associating things with a list that you already know is very nice. So perhaps the basic way of association is just numbers, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If you associate 1 with something, 2 with something, 3 with something, then that's some association that you would know. Now you can get quite fancy with this. Like for example, there is something called as the major system that helps you translate between words and numbers. Something to remember. So if you have like a long string of numbers is something you want to remember. I understand we don't do that as much in the era of cell phones. We could just store phone numbers, but just this core idea of you can like peg things with each other, that can help. And you can even create your own anchors. So like memory palace is one set of anchors, but you can just create any random list that you just brute force memorize. And then in the future, if you want to memorize some other things, then you can just associate it with the list that you have. And indeed, you can use the list that you already have in your brain, which is like a physical map, or you can create any random list and then just associate things with that list. So for example, I could have like Canon as my first item in the list. Then I could have iPhone as the second item. I could have marker as the third item, and so on. And then Canon, iPhone, marker, Canon, iPhone, marker. I just keep repeating that list so that I brute force memorize it. And next time I want to remember to carry my keys, my ID, and my gloves, then I would just associate Canon with my, let's say, keys. And again, I need to create like a bit of an image in my mind that will help. So for example, I can imagine the keys hanging off my camera or something like that, Canon camera. Then I can imagine my ID associated with my phone. So, I think of these ID card holder cases, phone cases that you get, that might help that. And then there is the marker, which could be associated with gloves. And I could imagine a image of poking the gloves with this marker. Just something random. We can probably come up with more absurd things, but that gives you an idea of how I might remember a list. Now, of course, 3-item list is easy to remember, but if you have to remember something more, then that's how it works. Okay, so this was memory so far, and I appreciate that in today's day and age, there is fewer and fewer things that we actually remember. And there's more and more ways to reference and recall things so that I don't really need to remember lists per se as much. Cool, understand. But I think you might agree with me that even in today's day and age, including in the age of AI, we still have to learn things. We still have to make connections and make inferences and, have wisdom and so on and so forth. And for that, how do you improve your performance? And by the way, in a simple sort of use case of it is just taking tests. Like people go to med schools, even today, people go to colleges and schools where they still have to write tests, and probably that will continue, especially if you're in a field like medicine or law, where memory seems to have quite an important role to play. Like you can't be checking the internet every time someone presents to you with a set of symptoms. It's good to memorize some things. And for testing and things like that. So for things like that, spaced repetition seems to do the trick. Now, what are spaced repetitions? There's a fair bit of evidence to suggest that spaced repetition might be a good idea. And what spaced repetitions is simply this idea that you review things again and again over time, but you space them out every single time. So think about it this way. The way we think normally learning would work is you would probably learn some things, and the hope is that you just remember. You just sleep and it just remembers. And to some extent you do. But what researchers found is refreshing your memory in increasing spatial units. So for example, you might learn something today, revise it tomorrow, then revise it 5 days from now, then revise it 10 days from now. And just spacing those repetitions seems to be quite good in keeping that memory and improving your performance. Excuse me. And this is the opposite of cramming. So if you have like a major test that you're preparing for, instead of cramming the previous night and just hoping that you have something, it's nice if you were to start earlier and then refresh your memory in equal or increasing spatial distances, and that will have a better retention rate. So you will remember things, especially in the long run, better. So spaced repetition seems to have some evidence for it. And finally, in this landscape, we are going to cover testing, meaning testing seems to be not just good for evaluation, to measure how others have learned and how yourself has learned, but testing seems to be quite nice in even aiding the learning process in itself. So if you test yourself, then you will improve your learning and memory associated with it. So one way I do these videos, as you can imagine, this is a lot of literature to cover. This is a lot of techniques to cover. And for me, I don't want to be reading things in real time and making sense of them. And I want things to come off my mind as much as possible. And so what I do is actually test myself, in this case, yesterday. So what I was doing was, I take AI, I put my list that I want to cover today in AI. So Claude AI is my AI of choice. And then I just ask Claude to, go section by section and just quiz me on the various things. Now, I don't ask it to quiz me necessarily on the dates or the author names or things like that. That I don't care too much, because that I'm happy to look up. And anyways, I think it's good to look up to get it right. But it's more about, do I remember the fact that, I have to cover a study here, and what's the key highlight of the study, and what's the punchline of the study? So for example, 58 meta-analysis, the thing with omega-3s. I want to remember something like that because it's punchy. It has a core evidence behind it. Similarly, all of these categories, all of this was coming from my memory. I wanted to remember this big list rather than, looking up, foods, what have I written in my notes, blueberries and so on. And the way I accomplished that, and generally other videos I've done on the neuroscience, is asking AI to just test me on my knowledge. And then I also ask it to keep it like keep a running trail of what am I missing. And at the end of it, I might ask it to test on it again, or I might just read the list that I've missed so that I have enough in my immediate working memory that I could just riff from memory for the most part. And then I only look at the notes when I think it might be important, or I have to get some things right, or just to ensure completeness. So it aids spontaneity in my view, therefore improving, hopefully, your experience on the other side. But anyway, testing is simply just asking yourself, testing yourself whether you remember things, and just the idea of that recall and that test will improve the memory on its own. And the mechanism, the hypothesis, so there's this nice study by Rodiger and Karpike in 2006. They found that testing enhanced long-term memory recall compared to just revision. So spaced repetitions, revisions are obviously good, they improve memory, but testing seems to have that added benefit of memory recall, especially when you think about the long term. So in the short term, spaced repetitions, revisions, cramming even might be good enough, but if you want something to commit in your brain for the long run, then testing is a fantastic way to do so. And the hypotheses that the researchers think, the reason why this is happening from a mechanistic standpoint, is it seems to be the case that testing forces the higher parts of your brain, the frontal parts of the brain, the cortical parts of your brain, the newer parts of your brain, to dialogue with the inner parts of the brain, which are perhaps more reptilian. So there seems to be this hippocampus cortex dialogue. Remember, hippocampus is the librarian. It does the first memory storage, and then it stores things. It gives things off to the cortex to store. And it seems like testing forces that dialogue to happen, or at least that's one hypothesis. All right, so Just to cover the lay of the land, we have now covered techniques. We have covered the memory palace, we have covered anchor systems, we have covered spaced repetitions, and we have covered testing. And hopefully that gives you a lovely arsenal to work with whenever you have to memorize things or whenever you have to commit things to memory, so that it can be of service to you and others. Okay, perfect. One last section and then we are done. Of course, we are going to talk about, this is a small section coming up, by the way. So we're almost done, this is to say. Okay, docs, give me a second. Final sip of water. Okay, let's go. All right, so to finally revise, we have covered food, we have covered habits, we have covered techniques, and now I'm going to cover this section which I call the undo section. Now, I've said this many times, so I'm not going to beat around the bush too much, but memory can be great if you want to learn something, if you want to enhance our capabilities and understanding of the world, if you want to make connections from seemingly disparate things, we need to hold things in memory. But oftentimes, we learn things, consciously or not, that we do not want to learn. We learn and memorize things and store things that do not serve our well-being and in fact might disturb us and might disturb our mental health. And trauma tends to be one of those things. And really what trauma is, if you look at it, is just conditioning with fear. Now, the trauma could be quite significant. For example, the classic case being PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, where war veterans face like really traumatic recollections of their time in war zones, and they're not easily able to adapt to peace times or time back at home, and they are quite distressed by these memories that come up. And on a lower dose levels, all of us might face similar things, perhaps with things that might have happened in childhood, perhaps equally intense, like things like assault and things happens. And acknowledge that it's a very sensitive thing to cover. And then there is so-called just fear, perhaps not even might not even be worthy of the word trauma, but things like, someone saying no brutally to you, or like a playground incident which someone did not include you, or a group of friends did not include you. These things can stick with us and can inform our decisions, especially in that critical period of childhood. And so there's this wide variety of emotional memories that we are better off not having, and then that do not serve us. So what do we do if we want to eliminate those memories, if we want to at least not have the charge that make us helpless in the face of these memories? And I suspect all of us have this to some extent or the other. And of course, the most serious cases are things like PTSD, where it can be quite disturbing. So in this section, I'm going to cover two things. One is eye movement desensitization reprocessing. This is a type of therapy, and we're going to cover the Pennebaker writing protocol. Before I talk about EMDR in particular, it's important to just revise our understanding of what we saw in the neuroscience section, where we saw that if you blocked if you block the parts of the brain like the amygdala, the emotional, the thing that seems to stamp memories with emotion, then you can recall memories. But if the amygdala stamp is no longer present, in that brief period where you recall memories seem to be quote unquote labile, meaning they are subjected to change. Now, this is quite an intriguing feature of the human brain, that you can take these long-term created memories and then you can just recall them, bring them back to consciousness as it were. And then if you perturb that. If you stop that, in the case of the mice, they did it chemically. In case of a lot of therapies, we do it cognitively. But there seems to be a little bit of a formula here that recall plus perturbation slash disturbance can lead to what we colloquially call healing. So that's how I mentally model it. Of course, it's not any formal mathematical equation, but just recalling memories, of course, in a safe, comfortable space, paired with a little bit of a disturbance. Now, this disturbance could come in the form of a cognitive challenge. So, for example, a cognitive behavioral therapist might ask you a question like, what is the likelihood that this memory is true, or the negative effects from this memory are true today? And that's a bit of a cognitive challenge. A meditator might ask you, who is it that was traumatized? And that might force you for a sense of self, and you might find that the self doesn't exist, and that can lead to healing. EMDR, coming to that, will ask you to do a bit of a physical perturbation by rapidly moving your eyes from side to side. So now coming to EMDR, the reason why I've included EMDR here prominently and not meditation or cognitive therapy and therapy in general is because there's specific evidence for EMDR when it comes to PTSD. So we know that it is effective for memories, and especially traumatic memories. And if you haven't had an EMDR session or don't know what it is, simply put, what it is the EMDR therapist will have some method of evoking that memories, of course, in a gentle and controlled way, hopefully. Now, this could be like writing things down or ask you to write things down. There's some variations in it, but broadly speaking, it looks like evoking that memory. And then they would ask you to move your eyes from side to side. So one therapist I worked with used like a pen, then they moved this side to side and asked me to follow it. I'm guessing people could use fingers, for example. There could be various ways, but really there's this sort of disturbance once you have recalled that memory that's happening, and that sort of a therapeutic technique seems to be quite effective in healing, really, to lose that association with memory. Now, there is some scientific evidence for this. That's why I include it. So there's a paper by De Jong in 2024. This is published in the Journal of Traumatic Studies, Journal of Traumatic Stress. And they found that EMDR led to improvements and they found that EMDR helped with PTSD and traumatic stress in general. The reason why this study is kind of nice to look at is because this study actually, in fact, look at 30 plus studies. So they're doing a little bit of a literature review of sorts. And again, 30 plus studies, to my eyes, very good evidence to suggest that EMDR is a powerful method when especially dealing with trauma and stress and past related stress. So that's something to look at. And if you are suffering from what you might call trauma or PTSD, I do highly recommend that you see someone who is an expert at EMDR. Now, I would also caution against just self-administering therapy, especially in the beginning. I would invite you to work with a therapist because there are other things that are happening that might be important, like, for example, the relationship with the therapist, the therapeutic alliance, as it's called. And if we work with people that we trust, that itself seems to have some therapeutic general benefit. And if the therapist blesses you later to do it yourself, then so be it. I'm not an EMDR therapist, obviously, so I'm not exactly sure on how easily it's recommended that you do it yourself. So I'm going to refrain from making comments with that, but seek a professional is what I'm trying to say here. And the second thing, perhaps for everyone, and it does not necessarily need you to see a therapist, is what's called the Pennebaker writing protocol. Now, this is a journaling protocol that seems to be quite effective in losing the emotional stamps that we have with memories. And if you have like a negative emotional stamp on certain memories, then this writing protocol might be something to look at. Now, what is this writing protocol? Simply put, you're going to take out your journal every day. The recommended is 4 times a week for 4 weeks. And what you're going to do is just write about your traumatic memory. Now, again, exercise caution here. If you think that your memories might be overwhelming or that you might not be able to handle it, work with someone. Like, there should be no shame in working with someone to heal yourself and to lose these parts of you that may not be serving you well. So, assuming you can do it yourself, the Pennebaker protocol, and of course, they can be done in conjunction, right? So, you could absolutely go to your professional and say that, look, I heard about this protocol, this writing protocol. Do you think it's right for me? Should we try this kind of thing? And if you feel healthy enough, I think you can try it yourself. But all you're doing is writing about an incident that has negative associations like fear for you. It could be big, could be small. And all you're doing is writing that for 4 times a week and for 4 weeks, and 15 to 20 minutes is the recommended time for writing it. And again, there's evidence to suggest that this leads to losing of that emotional stamp when it comes to that memory, otherwise in colloquial terms known as healing. So hopefully these two protocols are helpful. Now, of course, any kind of therapy will be useful, and there's meditation and things like that. Hypnosis is another big one. I've not covered those because I wanted to keep this video to memories and not just make it like a general therapeutic video. And in terms of memory and trauma and stress, these two seem to have the biggest evidence and most direct, specific evidence, which is why I've included them. So this concludes the applications section. Just to give you an overview before we conclude, we talked about how do you enhance your memory and learning and performance in 3 big categories of food, habits, and techniques. And then we spent time talking about what do you do if you have memories that you do not want? How do you press that undo button on memories? And so we talked about blueberries. We talked about all the evidence there is in blueberries, the studies that have looked at associations between dietary blueberry intake and the decline in cognitive aging. And we also know that it might be the anthocyanins in the blueberries that might be slowing down cognitive aging, enhancing the hippocampus function. So blueberries tend to be quite important. We also talked about the dosage, and it's the duration might matter more than the dose. We talked about omega-3s, and here the dosage really matters. Like a high dosage, 2000 mg plus, tends to have a lot of cognitive benefits, and there's a dose response pattern that we covered in detail. We talked about creatine, normally the drug used for performance and sport performance, I should say supplement and not drug, to not scare people off. Very high safety profile, studied across decades now, so very nice thing. But recent evidence also suggests that it might enhance cognitive performance. We then talk about habits. So these are things that you might consider making part of your lifestyle. And we talked about the critical importance of rest. So wakeful rest being, after your memory learning bout, after your performance, after when you're learning and thinking, this might help improve retention. So just closing your eyes, resting for 5 minutes might do wonders for your learning and memory. We talked about the big daddy of rest, which is sleep. This is where a lot of memory, long-term consolidation happens. We talked about exercise. This works on the mechanism of stressors after mild stressors, after learning bouts tend to enhance learning and memory. Same goes with cold exposure. And we talked about meditation as having some evidence of increasing hippocampal volume and also memory more directly. Pick and choose and see what works for you. Then we talked about techniques. So these are specific things like arrows in your arsenal that you could pull out based on the situation at hand. We talked about the memory palace techniques that a lot of memory athletes use to enhance their learning. We talked about the general idea of you can anchor things to anything, and that seems to improve memory. We talked about spaced repetitions, meaning you can revise things, and in the long run, you should revise them with increasing spaces, and that tends to enhance memory. And then we talked about the critical importance of testing, which can give you that added boost for long-term retention. So if you test yourself, that itself is a memory intervention, not just an evaluation. Finally, we talked about how do you undo memories, and the two specific therapies that have strong evidence for undoing the emotional stamps that are associated with memories, EMDR being one of the most evidence-based technique for post-traumatic stress disorder as a treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder, and a more perhaps day-to-day way to lose associations with negative memories might be the journaling protocol by Pennebaker. It's called the Pennebaker writing protocols, where you just disclose negative memories to yourself. No one has to know about it. It can stay with yourself. And you do that 4 times a week for 4 weeks, 15-20 minutes-ish. So this concludes our whirlwind tour of human learning and memory. In the grand scheme of things, we talked about the differences, the different types of memories we have. We talked about the story of HM, who taught us as neuroscience, as a field, that the part of the brain that might be critically important for human memory is the hippocampus and the associated regions like the entorhinal cortex. Then we went, and first of all, HM taught us there are different kinds of memories. Like a lot of memories about HM were intact, but a lot of them he lost. So for example, if a researcher visited him today, and then if they left the room and came back after a few hours, they would totally forget that they met this researcher. Brenda Milner being the superstar researcher who did a lot of this work for decades, like just incredible scientific work, perhaps one of the most important works ever done in neuroscience. So that's what we learned with the HM episode, where there are different types of memories, and then there's this critical part of the brain called the hippocampus that might act as the librarian of memory. Then we dug deep and we found the cells in the hippocampus and the entorhinal cortex, which is adjacent to the hippocampus, and we saw that it's involved in like tracking places. So these cells are called place cells, and in mice they fired at specific locations, and there's something called as grid cells that fire in multiple locations, creating a grid-like environment. So grid cells are more like a coordinate system, and place cells are more like specific locations, specific coordinates in that coordinate systems, and together they help you create a map of the world. And we saw that when an animal takes a route in a specific environment, the place cells fire in accordance to that route. So if you're in ABC, the place cells associated with ABC will fire. But when the animal is resting, there's also a replay of those place cells. So that suggests that we are consolidating some memories. And this replay also happens in reverse, especially after the animal has achieved reward and so on. And this replay also happens at sleep. And this replay is, by the way, is very compressed. It's not happening in the same time. So that's what we learned, that the brain maintains maps of the environment, and your trajectory in this environment is replayed and consolidated by the brain whenever it gets a chance to rest. And so there are these different phases of memory, which is, the encoding phase where you're learning, the retrieval phase, the consolidation phase. So this is the various modes in which memory operates. And then we learn that this map can extend to abstract spaces. So we can talk about hierarchies in societies. We can talk about the moral hierarchies. We can talk about things like the various facial features. So we can encode various maps in our brains. And that could be techniques, that could lead to techniques on how to memorize things. Indeed, we saw the memory palace is a very neat extension of just using a map in your brain and pairing it with things that you already know. Using a map in the brain and pairing it with things that you wish to know. And finally, we talked about how do emotional memories happen. So how we know memories are important, but we also know memories carry emotional content. So how does this emotional stamping of memories occur? And there we found a region of the brain called the amygdala might be critically important in stamping memories with their emotional content. And it tends to be quite responsive to stress in the body. So if you have like some amount of stress, a healthy controlled stress in the body, then that might impact this retention, this stamping process. Finally, we went to techniques, and we covered techniques in 4 categories to improve our learning and memory. Well, specifically 3 categories for improving and 1 category for losing our learning and memory. We talked about the foods, we talked about habits, we talked about techniques, and we talked about things that you can do to undo some emotional memories if you do not want them. I hope you enjoyed this overview, this whirlwind tour of the science of learning and memory. I hope you are left with a better understanding and appreciation for this beautiful human brain and the human memory and learning systems. And you are left with practical strategies and tools that you can start implementing today, whether it be a matter of habits and building a lifestyle around it, for example, with things like meditation or just prioritizing sleep better, or things like techniques that you can use strategically as and when needed. Of course, there's food that you can eat that can make you feel better. And for the memories that are not serving us well, hopefully you have some things in your arsenal now to make your mental health a little bit better. It's been a pleasure. It's just been a treat for even me to just learn about all of these studies and synthesize my understanding of learning and memory, and my appreciation for this human brain has just increased radically in the course of making this series of videos, in the course of making this series, and it's just been a joy, and it's enhanced my day-to-day work as well. So because I just have a better understanding of the human brain. So thank you for being with me for all this time. Hope you enjoyed this and hope you benefited from it. Thank you. Thank you for joining. Okay, stop recording there. Fantastic. Fantastic. I hope you enjoyed that overview there. Lots of people in the chat here, or watching at least. So this is what's going to happen next. So these three, first of all, if you don't know, if you're here for the first time, there are 3 videos. Today was the part 3, but there's part 1 and part 2 live streams that you can go and watch. What's going to happen for the next couple of weeks is I'm going to record an introduction. I am going to edit those videos. So this is going to take weeks. So I'm not sure when's the next time you'll see me live, but you can trust that I'm working on these videos and trying to create the compressed, high density version of what we just did, and you can watch that when it's out. But before that, either you can go and watch the other 2 memory videos if you're interested in memory specifically, or what I recommend actually is watching the dopamine video, which has already gone through this whole process. So there have been 3 dopamine live streams, then there was a compressed edited version that is out, which you can find on my channel. If you just go to my channel, go to videos, the first video will be on the controlling your dopamine, and you will find like a very detailed overview of dopamine along with techniques that you can use to enhance your dopamine. I'm just going to try and also pull up something here, which is this thing, which is this emotional intelligence scorecard that I invite you to check out. It's a quiz that I created based on my experience with the PhD and testing people. It's my quiz. It's not like a clinical quiz or anything, but it gives you a score on these areas of emotional intelligence, and it will tell you which areas you're good at, which areas you lack, and it will also suggest episodes, free episodes from my podcast that might be the most relevant to you. So it will customize things a little bit. So I highly recommend. It also puts you on my mailing list, and you'll hear about things from me occasionally. I don't use it too much, the mailing list, but it's kind of nice. So that's it for today. Thank you for joining me. Quite a long live stream. I haven't had food, so this is my cue to go and eat something. But thank you for joining me. I hope you had fun, and yeah, see you next time.